Thank you. My name's Andy Martin, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I'm going to try and walk you through where my brain goes when I think about legacy through a developmental lens. But I'm going to need the clicker. Awesome. Thank you. I've worked in education for 20-odd years in a few places around the world. My specialisms include early childhood development, inclusion, special educational needs and disabilities, sports coaching, and the safeguarding of children and young people. I'm an active safeguarding officer in sport and the founder of a social project called Guard Sport, which looks to bridge the gap between policy and culture in sport. And a few years ago now, I published a book about a little dragon that found it very hard to control her fire. My days are full of variety, from language groups with 4-year-olds to coaching an under-19s rugby squad a few moments later. But no matter what I'm teaching or coaching, I always try and come at everything from a developmental perspective, which, in my opinion, is the single most important perspective for any educator to understand. And sadly, one that isn't always covered in education, particularly teacher training, as much as it should be. So what does legacy look like from a human development perspective? Why are we the way we are? Well, we can't answer this question without starting from the very, very beginning. And as we go through this talk, I want you to just keep this little bit of information at the front of your minds. When a child is developing inside its mother's womb, from the point of about 3 months, a fetus already carries the genetic information necessary for the creation of the next generation. So, 6 or 7 months before that child is born, the potential genetic information is already there for the next generation. So, 3 generations of DNA and potential DNA are present inside that pregnant mother. In creating life, we're also creating the potential for future life. That's a concept that we all understand well, but it has quite complicated ramifications. One of the earliest professional experiences that I had was working in nurture groups in North London, working with children who had a range of adverse childhood experiences. And I can honestly say that those experiences, for me, shaped me more than almost any other, predominantly due to the relevancy of understanding that I began to develop around human development and the multiple impacts, relational, attachment, environment, etc., that we have upon it. Now, we can't talk about legacy without considering it in the context of human development and everything that affects it. Environmental legacy, cultural legacy, family legacy, physical legacy, emotional legacy, traumatic legacy, generational legacy. At TTS, we use the phrase generations of excellence, a school which has an incredible history of now over 100 years. Amazing, truly multi-generational. And we recognize our legacy as being a profoundly positive one. But we must always recognize that every person that enters our school, however old, is already carrying with them a personal legacy that potentially spans back a very, very long way. There's a great quote by Gabor Mate, and he says that human beings are affected by our environment as soon as we have an environment, our first being the womb. And this is a grounding concept, because environments impact us constantly. We live in highly complex sensory conditions that bombard our bodies, processing systems with inputs to categorize and sort and create responses for. And it's almost incomprehensible to think that our 90-odd billion neurons function in the way they do to create the living human as we know it. All of your legacies began before you were born, and possibly even before your biological parents were born. You are literally layers and layers and layers of human development, both genetically and environmentally. Now, the largest period of brain development happens inside the mother's womb, with about 86 billion neurons formed by birth. That's about 40 to 50,000 neurons a second, to put that into context. And when we think about this, it leads me to think that we have to consider legacy as a concept that happens to us as well as by us. It's dynamic. Who are we? Why do we behave the way we do? Are we living parts of our ancestors' experiences? So when we think about legacy in the context of human development, we have to discuss epigenetics. Now, epigenetic understanding has been around for a little while now, and it considers gene expression. Simply, gene expression does not involve changes to someone's DNA or genetic code, but it concerns the way the genes behave. In essence, which ones can be switched off and which ones can be switched on, and why that happens. During development, the DNA that make up our genes, they accumulate chemical markers, effectively, that determine how much or how little of that gene is expressed. And what research is beginning to show, and evidence, is that these gene traits can be passed on generationally. So, epigenetics can affect a person's development, health, behaviour, and these changes can be influenced by environmental factors and can potentially shape the genetic expression and health outcomes of the next generation. Now, most of this research focuses on the impact of trauma, rightly so. And I'm going to look at that in a little bit more detail now. Now, we know that exposure to early trauma causes a reprogramming of stress responses, altercations in the structure and the development of the brain, and a changed perception on how we view stress. It affects our behaviour, our regulation, literally how we think and feel, and our capacity to integrate our bodily systems. So, understanding legacy is understanding human development. Think again about that unborn fetus and the 3 generations of DNA and potential DNA, and imagine that that fetus is trying to develop in a mother surviving in a war zone. During the height of the conflict in Syria, the WHO began to use a new diagnostic phrase, and they called it human devastation syndrome, to describe the trauma that the children were going through. Not dissimilar to what we're seeing in other parts of the world at the moment. Trauma that would be and is being carried by their children through their whole lives. Trauma that in different ways would challenge and present itself through their whole lives. These children would go on to become mothers and fathers, carrying this experience through pregnancy, potentially, and into parenthood. The legacy of experience, this legacy of experience can manifest in all manner of ways. Parent-infant attachment processes, interpretation of social experience, anxiety, life choices, health, physical and mental. Multiple research studies over the last 30 years have shown the generational impact of traumatic experience and the potential impact these experiences have on the gene expression of the next generations. But trauma doesn't just happen in war zones. I spend a lot of time talking about safeguarding in sport, and one of the things that I talk about with coaches is being aware of their own histories, their own experiences, and in some cases their own traumatic experiences, and how this can affect the way that they interact with their athletes. I call it the intersection of relational understanding and sports coaching, but really it's just how coach, athlete, and environment interact together. You see, sport can have tremendous healing power, and I've been lucky to see this in a number of environments. The Centre for Healing and Justice Through Sport and the brilliant Dr. Bruce Perry state that sport is naturally structured to provide relational dosing that is much more therapeutically sensitive than traditional therapy. If we make coaches 5% more trauma-informed or developmentally sensitive, we will have more therapeutic impact on children than if we trained an entire new cohort of trauma practitioners. Sounds simple. But I can tell you from experience that when you open the door to personal experiences that often high-level coaches had as athletes, only then can you start to understand the whys, and only then do they start to understand the whys. Sport is beginning to wake up to trauma-informed practice, but there's still a very long way to go in sport and in education generally. So let's go back to my time working in nurture groups 20-odd years ago now. The children were there, they presented with a range of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, some of which were undoubtedly generational. The impact of generational poverty, for one, is extremely well documented. But what I experienced was the impact of the right approach on altering life trajectories. And though we didn't know it at the time, even potentially influencing the gene expression and behaviour in the very makeup of the children. The power of the right environment and the necessary relationships changed the children's negative attachment legacies And it's likely that further research, and as it develops, will find that epigenetic changes are a result of environmental exposure, and therefore are changeable. So what about my own family legacy? In 2020, in the middle of COVID, my mum wrote a letter to her grandchildren. Dear grandchildren, when I retired from working, I was looking forward to having time and the opportunity to spend it with you guys, sharing stories from my childhood days and beyond, and doing all kinds of activities with you, and sharing your company, walking on a beach, climbing mountains, or playing a game. But life does not always turn out the way you want it to. So, for better or worse, I've decided to write it all down. You may not read it now, but I hope at some point in your lives you will, and you'll be able to take something from it. Sadly, she never got to finish writing her stories, as she became too ill and ran out of time. She wanted to leave it as a legacy, something for her grandchildren to tap into and revisit. But the reality with legacy, as we've just seen, is that it's constantly developing. It's adapting, it's subject to environment, and it's without doubt generationally impactful. Whilst my mum's experiences didn't change the genetic code of her grandchildren, they almost certainly played roles in which genes were switched on and which genes were switched off. Her imprint was already there, as was their grandfather's. And this, together with the experiences and environments that their mother, my wife, and I had throughout our childhoods and beyond, formed the humans that we know our children to be now. So, legacy is about who you are now and how you came to be this way. It's about the continuous impact you have on others and the environment that surrounds you, and the impact that it has on you. Dr. Mine Jonkpaye from the UK puts it perfectly when she says, nature and nurture should not be pitted against one another, but rather viewed in terms of their interrelationship. So, legacy equals nature plus nurture times time. At TTS, we're lucky. We've had 100 years of time, and hopefully producing positive legacy and assisting healing when needed. So my questions to you and future generations are you in touch with your legacy? Do you understand it? What will it say about you? What will be its imprint? So what does this mean from an educational perspective? Well, I recently read an article by Rachel Yehuda and Amy Lerner from 2018, who are leaders in the field of intergenerational trauma in the US. And they say, look, there's now converging evidence supporting the idea that offspring are affected by parental trauma exposures occurring before birth and possibly even prior to conception. And this has a huge implication for how we set up educational environments into the future. So, environmental exposure may lead to a change in the function of DNA that can be potentially passed to future generations. One of my favourite quotes of all time is from Dr. Lisa Cherry, who's a UK-based academic and writer on trauma, and she says, whatever the question, relationships are the answer. So what is it in education that helps us prevent or heal negative or traumatic legacies? Well, on top of high-quality relationships, it definitely includes better teacher training in human diversity. It definitely includes altering curriculum design to avoid unnecessary early cognitive stress. Let's let children be children as long as we can. It must include specific education around trauma-informed practice and self-regulation. It must include deeper understanding of human development and how to design curriculums and schools based on available neuroscience and what we know now, not clinging to some outdated models and structures. But for me, the biggest thing that ties all this together, and the one thing that we know has the biggest potential to aid development no matter what your legacy history, is the understanding that nothing replaces connection, belonging, and an understanding of human difference. Our uniqueness is the legacy of generations and generations of human development. So perhaps here at TTS and beyond, if we understand legacy through a developmental lens, then hopefully we can continue positively influencing even more generations of excellence. I'm going to leave you with a short children's poem. It's called I'm Just Being Me, but I've changed one word, see if you can guess which one it is. And it goes like this. My body finds it hard sometimes to do what I want it to do. It likes to bounce about a bit like a caged-up kangaroo. If I need to ask a question, I find it hard to wait my turn. And saying, put your hand up, never helps me learn. Stay still, my teacher often calls when my body's bouncing off the walls. But my body needs to bounce, I say, trying to keep my feelings at bay. You see, my body can sense all the little things, like the hairs on the carpet which feel like stings. So if I wriggle around when the other kids are not, please be patient with me. You don't need to lose the plot. Sometimes you'll even find me underneath my desk, which my teacher seems to find particularly grotesque. Crisscross legs would loudly be the call, but my body's better if I'm leaning on a wall. What's wrong with me wandering peacefully whilst I read my favourite book? If you wander quietly with me, I'll let you have a look. I have expert knowledge in many subjects, and I rarely forget a thing. I can name every country on earth whilst doing a Highland fling. So if I shout about a bit while other kids sit quiet, I'm just trying to share my thinking, not cause a small-scale riot. My body's trying to regulate and process all its senses. So the last thing I need to think about are even more consequences. You see, everyone is unique and can react in different ways. It's hard for me to handle change, and I don't like holidays. So if I'm underneath the table or being a little bit loud, I'm possibly feeling overwhelmed from being in a crowd. My memory is my superpower, and I love to share my knowledge. One day I'll change the world with something I learn in college. You see, our bodies and our brains are always interacting. Senses become feelings, which can sometimes be distracting. We're all on this earth together, all brilliantly unique and diverse. Not one person is the same anywhere in the universe. So if I'm bouncing off the walls, connection is the key. Please don't ever forget. I'm just being my legacy. Thank you very much.